Is coming to you from the beautiful metaverse. And welcome to Midday with Rev Don. And today, um, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm glad that you're joining me for our conversation. And I think that I will be continuing the themes that we've been talking about this week. We have been talking about clairvoyance, oracle work, etc. I thought today I would talk a little bit about the nature of the soul. Um, There was some commentary about ghosts and the paranormal, and I thought I would speak a little bit to that because although not exactly the same field as psychic work, it is, of course, in the same field as psychic work. And it's something I thought people would find interesting. Will it be the only thing we discuss in our half hour? That depends on if people bring other things up. Please feel free to say hello. Hello to Mary in the chat room. Good to see you. Um, so I'm going to start. Hello to Jody. Jody says, I believe too, or I wouldn't be here. There's a lot to believe. Um, and like most people in the pagan world, I've had all kinds of experiences with those who are in spirit. I mean, anyone who is at all familiar with the Correllian tradition, or even our conversations the last few days, know how heavily we work with the ancestors and the spirit guides. So working with those who are in spirit is very big to us. And hello to Heidi. Um, Heidi says these themes are highly relevant for me. My husband died 1 year ago last Saturday. I'm so sorry to hear that, Heidi. And yes, they are very relevant. Um, so we'll talk a little bit about what happens when someone crosses over as part of this conversation. Um, Death has been a companion of mine from very early on. I was very close to my grandmother. She died when I was very young. A number of other relatives died when I was quite young. My parents both died when most people would say I was still young, not that young, um, but it's been a long time. So I've known a lot of people who've crossed over, and I've often worked with them in spirit. It gives one a different perspective of life and death. And I've often heard people say, I don't believe in life after death. I know because I've experienced working with the spirits. And some of us have also had near death experiences, such as myself, which also tell us, yes, this is very much real. So, probably the most important question as we begin our conversation of spirits, ghosts, and the paranormal is what is the difference between a spirit and a ghost? And of course, there's not a universal answer to this because different schools of thought treat these words differently. It's like the word soul or the word monad. You'll find different understandings depending on the person's background. My understanding and the background that I come from, and it's not an uncommon one, is that a spirit is that part of the soul that goes on after death, that part of the person who goes on after death, and has crossed over and is fully conscious, fully activated in the spirit world. They can act as a spirit guide. They can communicate at will if they choose to, or be communicated with if they choose to, but they are in no way trapped or held back. Hello to Arlene in the chat room. They are fully conscious, independent beings. They are a part of the soul. The soul has many lives, and so it also has many aspects in its spiritual state as well. I'm often asked how we can believe in ancestors and reincarnation at the same time, and the answer is that the soul is not just a bigger form of our mind, it's far more complex. And that part that lived, um, the higher self that lived the life that has ended, will always be part of the soul, even as the soul goes forward through many incarnations. The soul is complex enough for that to be the case. And the other thing about a spirit, as opposed to a ghost, is that you're really dealing with the higher self of the person. The part that I think in some branches of voodoo, it's called the good angel, um, the higher self, the true will. That part of the being becomes an ancestor, becomes a spirit. Um, and the limiting parts of the being are left in this world. They'll be picked back up when the spirit reincarnates. But if spirit has truly crossed over, those aspects will not be there. And hello to Deb in the chat room. Good to see you. Um, a ghost, on the other hand, is a totally different phenomenon. And if you look at the experiences people have when they work with spirits versus when they encounter ghosts, they're very different. Ghosts have been described in a number of different ways. I would say that they are souls. They are a portion of the spirit that is caught between the worlds and unable to move on. Uh, it's part of the shadow. The larger being experiences it as part of the shadow, and if you do shadow work, you may find parts of your past lives that have been caught this way because they could not move forward from certain things. And others may experience them as ghosts. Um, I have heard ghosts described as recordings of traumatic events. I don't quite see it that way. I see that the energy of the spirit is at least partly trapped in that traumatic event that happened. Ghosts are usually associated with traumatic events or with strong focus. Sometimes worry, for example, sometimes concern may cause part of the soul to be held back that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's been no crossing at all, but part has not been able to, and it's stuck there. And I'm told um, when you are working in the astral plane, I'm told that if you come across that ghost, for want of a better way to put it, it's going to seem like it's cocooned. It's likely to be, for want of a better way to put it, in shades of gray. It's not really there in the spirit world. It's caught between. And we use the term between the worlds, caught between the worlds, to describe that because it's not really been able to leave this one and therefore not fully able to enter that one. People who die violently sometimes have this problem. People who die with unresolved business sometimes have this problem. That doesn't necessarily mean that no part of their soul has crossed over, um, but not all of it. And this is why when you encounter a ghost, you don't really encounter a whole being. You seem to encounter certain aspects of the being. They often will repeat the same act over and over and over again, or they'll be obsessed with one thought, because that's the part of them that's caught there. The rest may very well have crossed over. I have a friend who encountered the ghost of a woman who had died tragically and lost her mother's brooch, I believe it was. And she felt she could not cross over until she found that brooch. She was obsessed with this, and no other aspect of her being was commented upon. But that's the kind of thing you might find with a ghost. At our old headquarters in Hoopston, there were many ghosts who had died of the influenza pandemic after the First World War because it had been used as a makeshift hospital for people suffering from influenza who had been pulled off the trains that went right next door. And so there were a number of ghosts associated with that building who had died in that tragic manner, and for the most part had no idea they were dead. Um, Arlene says she saw a half a dozen ghosts at Ground Zero several years ago calling out. It would be the same thing. Often, those who have died don't always know they have died, especially if they die suddenly or tragically. And hello to John in the chat room. Um, and what do you do when you encounter this? What should you do? Um, you should try to help them cross over. Um, Assuming that you are skilled in psychic work, certainly don't be scared of them. There's nothing to be scared of. Don't run from them, but rather talk to them. Try to find out why they have not crossed over. Help them to cross over. Um, it's cliched, but help them cross into the light. The entrance to the other world for many people will assume the appearance of a door leading into into a white or a blue light. And hello, Renee, in the chat room. It's good to see you. Um, Although it can appear in any number of different ways, sometimes the entrance to the afterlife will appear in other ways than a doorway. Particularly in previous years, a river that had to be crossed was not uncommon. There's no one way. Um, for want of a better way to put it, it's like when you make a magic circle and you're visualizing the barrier. You can see it in many different ways. The barrier between the worlds is the same. When a person dies, again, they don't always know that they've died, and some of our traditional mourning practices were to help the deceased to realize what had happened. Um, Usually, however, they will know that their loved ones who have gone before will be there to help them, um, and they will cross over. And then usually they need a period of rest, having crossed over, or we need that period of rest. But a mourning period of about a year is a good idea. And during that time, you can certainly honor them, but you shouldn't try to communicate with them. Let them have that year to establish themselves. And this is both for them and for us. And hello, Julia, in the chat room. Um, People often talk about those who have died trying to pull the living over. That's not actually what normally happens. It's the other way around. It's we who have trouble letting go of them, though it can go both ways. That year of mourning is for both. It's for their healing and our healing. And then we can establish our relationship to them as an ancestor and spirit guide, which is very simple. You make offerings to them, you speak to them on a daily basis, you sit for messages from them. It's relatively easy to create that relationship, especially if you have opened psychically, you know how to do clairvoyance and so forth. Um, and I highly recommend it because it will really change your relationship to life and death. And sometimes your relationship to those who have crossed over. And hello to Kazan in the chat room. Good to see you. Um, Sometimes, I've often heard people say, if Uncle Frank was a worthless drunk in life, he'll still be no good Uncle Frank in spirit. That's not my experience. It might depend how you're approaching it. I would say that if you find that, you are limiting the relationship because what you should be encountering, if they've truly crossed over, is their higher self. And hello to Sean in the chat room. Good to see you. You should be encountering the higher self, not the limitations of this life. When my father died, my father was a very difficult man in many ways. In other ways, he had many good points too. I'm not saying otherwise, but the bad points were pretty bad at times. But when he died, his spirit, we were able to talk with his spirit almost immediately. He didn't need that year to cross over, and his spirit was beautiful. All of the negativity that he had manifested in life through mental illness was not part of his spirit. He had not carried that forward. It was for the purpose of lessons here. And his spirit was simply not like that. And I think you'll find that in general, the spirit will be the higher self, the best the person could have been in life. The ghost, on the other hand, if you're encountering a ghost, will be all those lower self aspects. Um, Still powered by energy from the higher self that's caught between the worlds. Should you, if you have a ghost in your house, hire an exorcist? I would say no, um, unless that's your background. Much better to just help the spirit cross over, as we discussed. You don't really need um, anything else, and chances are you may bring in someone who may make matters worse through their own attitudes and flamboyance. The paranormal field is a very fascinating field. Lots of interesting things to see there, lots of interesting things to learn, and a lot of crackpots. Um, some of those crackpots are crackpots to make money. I think the prevailing stereotype is the ghost hunter um, in the dark house taking advantage of every little sound to say, "Oh my God, it's a demon," or what have you. Um, when obviously it was not. Um, or, I often comment on how for a little while I was watching these ghost hunting programs, and it seemed like on some of them, every show, there was a demon in the basement. What did the demon do that told them it was a demon? Eh, a couple of things moved around. It was actually a poltergeist. Nothing to worry about at all if they had known what they were doing. We'll talk about poltergeists in a moment too. A poltergeist is neither a ghost nor a spirit, but that's part of this conversation. Um, some of the people most famous in the paranormal business are also some of the most dubious, in my opinion. Don't get me going on the Warrens. I don't think highly of them. I think they were a conservative Christian couple with an axe to grind who were trying to promote a certain point of view about metaphysics that was entirely fear-based, and their work is essentially worthless, in my opinion. Don't get me started on The Exorcist, the movie that really popularized so many things when I was a child, because I know the actual story, um, and it is nothing like that movie. And their big gimmick was this is based on a true story, and that is the most charitable way to put it. It was barely based on what was in fact. If it was anything, it was a poltergeist. And that's true of many things like that. Chances are, if someone's having a frightening experience, it's probably a poltergeist as opposed to either a ghost or a spirit, though it does depend. And we have a couple of comments in the chat room. I want to take a moment. The Dusty Dud says, I was on an old prison ghost hunt tour. The prison was built in the 1800s, I think. The Missouri State Prison. Can a bad person's energy follow you from place to place? Or is it stuck at the place of death? And I would say that either of those two things can be true. If it follows you, you probably have some kind of karmic connection to it, but you might even find it could be part of a past life. Hello to James in the chat room. James is asking how we can help them to cross over. We did discuss that a while ago, but I will discuss that again before the end of the program. Hello to Julia, who said that they had a spirit tell them he was angry and tell them how he died. And they've never really connected with the spirit again. Well, it might have frightened you. Hello to Mary in the chat room. Thank you for being here. There's really not a lot to be frightened of with spirits. People often think, or with ghosts, I should say, people often think ghosts are powerful. They are not. They are an echo of a life no longer in this world. You are a life right now in this world. That makes you more powerful than they are right from the get-go. Although you do need to have a sense of yourself to have confidence in that. And, Hollywood and certain religious backgrounds have gone way out of their way to make people frightened of these experiences. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit. Well, I want to go back to the question from the Dusty Dud about whether a spirit can follow you. And my answer to that is yes. But what you do with that is still the same things. If you do proper shielding, if you help them to cross over, that's the best solution. Grounding the energy. That is the number one answer to any situation like this if you are frightened by it. We were talking about Ouija boards the other day, and I know some people do have frightening experiences with them. I talked a little bit about why I think that is, a lot of which is expectation. But whatever it is, you ground the energy and it's gone. Nothing can happen without energy. If you understand energy, you should have no problem. And it's true here too. Now with poltergeists are the origin of most frightening ghost stories. And poltergeists are not ghosts or spirits. They are unbalanced energy, ungrounded energy. And if energy is ungrounded enough, a lot of things can happen. Most of those aren't really dangerous, but they might still frighten a person who does not understand. In the story of The Exorcist, in the real story that became that movie, the biggest thing that happened was furniture shaking. That can absolutely happen with ungrounded energy. What do? You ground the energy. Um, Things like that cannot manifest without energy. Um, the Bell Witch is a major story from the 1800s about what is commonly believed to have been a poltergeist. That was very frightening in some of its manifestations. And this is something, and of course, because we have such a short format here, um, I can't get to every detail, but that's why we're continuing to talk about it over the course of several days. When a poltergeist manifests, one of three things is happening in most cases. Notice I say most. I don't know if there's ever an occasion to say all, but in most cases, one of three things will obtain. Most commonly, there is a young person who is either just about to come into puberty or just did, and their energy is going haywire, which is giving all the extra energy to allow um, the poltergeist to manifest. This is especially true if that young person is also highly psychic. Um, this also happens sometimes with women who hit menopause, and the same thing happens. Their energy becomes much harder to control for a time because of this change taking place, and it can cause things to manifest in this way as well. The other one is when people are, if you have an open psychic of any kind, and they're not grounding that energy as they should, um, that can cause these things too, because all that extra energy is there. And if they don't really understand what they're doing, it's not necessarily focused the way. I would never expect this to happen around myself, for example, because when I work with energy, it's very focused. It's very clear on what I'm doing. Even in a temple situation where the energy vortex may be left permanently and constantly added to, I wouldn't expect bad things to happen because it's all purified energy. It's all good energy. It's all directed energy. There really should not be negative or unfocused energy there. But someone who doesn't know those things, someone who doesn't know those practices, can have a lot of unfocused or negative energy around them. And hello to Surdware in the chat room. And Surdware says, if I may ask, how do you feel about chip coffee? I don't know if I've ever tried that kind of coffee. Oh, that's a person. Uh, Surdware says, I know he used to work with children and teens who have gifts, but I haven't heard him being on TV much lately. But then again, I don't watch it too much. I've never actually heard of this person, so I can't really say how I feel about them. Um, and and Arlene says, you just explained how I was able to cause sounds in my bedroom growing up. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly so. So going back to chip coffee, what I will say, if they worked with children and teens, I think that was a good thing. If they were teaching good practices. I don't like the word gifts personally because I don't feel like any of this is a gift. It's a skill. You might have an aptitude for it, but you have to build the skill like anyone else would. Um, and I think the reason I don't like the word gift is seen so many people trying to devalue it for that reason. It's like some people will devalue a handmade gift for a holiday because it was made by hand instead of purchased. And some people want to develop psychic and magical skills on the premise that they are a gift rather than a skill, when in fact they are very much skills. And hello to Michael in the chat room. Um, but I think it's very good to work with people while they're young. I think pagan parents absolutely should. I think psychics who have children absolutely should, because the best time to learn is while you're young, particularly because often we're very open as children and then shut down around the time we reach adolescence. And that can be very destructive to people. But unless there's an adult there to explain how not to do this and why not to do this, it's very hard to avoid. And Julia says, mine happened after visiting a spiritual church and not thinking much of it. So perhaps it was the energy there. Yes, absolutely, it could have been. And the Dusty Dud says, I remember when I was little, I lived in a house built in 1893. I remember seeing a guy in a bedroom staring at a wall like a Yankee soldier, and he was transparent looking, like he was on guard. That's a perfect example of a ghost. And the fact that this was all he was doing is also part of that aspect of being a ghost rather than a spirit. Now, I had promised earlier that we would revisit the issue for James of how you can help when you find a spirit trapped between the worlds. Um, oh, and Sertwer remarks that this gentleman used to work with Ryan Buell on Paranormal State. Now, I may have interviewed him. I interviewed most of the cast of Paranormal State um, a little over a decade ago. We are good friends with Michelle Belanger, who was part of that team, and she arranged for us to interview the entire cast. It was fascinating. Um, and Serdwer remarks that Ryan also brought in the Warrens on the rare occasion. Well, I've already said what I think of that, but he says Chip always seemed to me to be very gentle and proper, and that speaks highly of him. And I think I do actually now remember him. Now that you have helped me to place him, and I remember the other gentleman, whom I'm assuming this was, as being a very nice person. So if you encounter a ghost, what do? You want to help them to cross over. So I was saying the ghost is a portion of the being. Other parts may have already crossed over or not. It all depends on the circumstance. But what you want to do is you want to help them um, to cross over. You want to find out why they're still here. If they're afraid, why are they afraid? Very often, if they've come from a Judeo-Christian background, they're afraid of divine judgment on the other side. And you want to let them know that on the other side is only love and acceptance. That will often help them to cross over much more easily. Let them know that their loved ones are waiting for them. And if you are sufficiently advanced, clairvoyantly, take them by the hand and lead them over. Encourage them on the way. If they're afraid, tell them that they don't need to be afraid. This is a very simple explanation, but this is what you do. The entrance to the other world will appear to you. For a lot of people, it appears as a door of some sort, often a gate of light. The whole thing about go into the light. It's how many people will see the entrance to the other world, but it's not the only way. Some people will perceive it as going over a river. There are some people will perceive it as going through a tunnel or a cave. These are all perfectly fine. You yourself will see it in the right way for you. The spirit you're working with might actually be seeing it totally differently. But what matters is that you cross them over. And most commonly, often they don't know they're dead. You have to help them to know that they have passed on and their loved ones are waiting for them, which they will be. I was reading an account the other day to show you what I sometimes do with my time. But it was one of these like Reddit threads of people's dying words. And there was this woman who apparently had not been a very nice person, but she believed very much that the loved ones come for you when you die. And apparently her last words were a frightened, they're not coming, because she felt they weren't coming for her. That means she was aware she had not been a very nice person and she was afraid, but they were still coming to help her over. They always do. One of the things that sometimes happens is the person wasn't a very good person. They know it. And so they're afraid of crossing over, but they don't need to be. And that's part of what you often will have to convince them of. Other times it'll be something, I mentioned the lady with the brooch. Not really anything terribly important, but it was important to that part of that spirit. Had I been the person working, I think I would have suggested to her that she had it right there in her pocket. and she might have found it if because she's in the astral, things will appear if you call them. But but then again, it all depends on the circumstances. But these are things that that you would do to help them cross over. Perhaps on another occasion, we'll do a more thorough discussion of that. Um, and Serdwer remarks that he enjoys my and other people's perspectives, like my statement about the Warrens, as it allows them to view things differently. And just going back, not to the Warrens as such, but to my whole understanding of metaphysics, I live in a friendly universe. That's not to say nothing bad ever happens. That's not to say there's never conflict. That's not to say you don't need to worry about things like shielding and protection. Those are the very first things I teach people after grounding and along with it. But what I am saying is that a fear-based understanding of metaphysics, in my opinion, is a very bad idea. More so because as magical people, we should know that how we view things influences them. The observer is part of the observed. And if you're starting from the point of view you're going to have a bad experience, how can you not? If you're doing magic for something you don't believe you can have, how do you think you're going to get it? Because you are manifesting that outcome, and not only consciously. That's why shadow work is so important. So having a friendly attitude toward the universe, I think, is very helpful. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people get a lot of energy out of an unfriendly attitude toward the universe. That it's big, bad, and spooky out there. It's all oogie boogie. I'm never going to be the person who tells you that point of view. It's totally anathema to my point of view. I have all my life worked with metaphysics, and I have always found it a positive experience. And I think anyone who approaches it sensibly with good instruction will have a positive experience. Now, if you get drunk and go to the graveyard with a bunch of frat boys and your Ouija board, well, yeah, that might not go to a good place. But start by not getting drunk. So with that, we will have our prayer and close for today. And tomorrow we will have our interview with Joan Forrest Mage of the Life Force Arts Center in Chicago. I hope that you enjoy that. And we will see you then. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to be with us and guide us as we go forward. Help us to remain centered and focused and grounded as we go forward in our lives, and to handle our energy well. And when the end of our life comes, let us make a good transition, knowing that we are not truly separate from this world at all, and that the living and the spirits stand hand in hand, as long as they choose to do so. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with love and with respect. And may you blessed be. And until next time, may you blessed be. And we'll see you then.